Hello everyone. So today I am going to talk to you about what we had left of chapter 3. We had begun to talk about different research methods, different ways of collecting data really, right? But before we get to that, let me just go over some of the concepts and let's start off. So let's start off with looking at the interactive model that we talked about just as a way of revision, right? Here you can see that, this is the interactive model that we talked about. Now you can see this that, the research questions are at the very center of this model, right? And I'd already asked you to construct 3 kinds of research questions. That's something that, we'll go over again. Then, here at this part are your goals. Then you have your conceptual framework, you have your methods here, and your validity here. And part of your methods is, part of it is how you intend to collect your data. And that's something we'll talk about. But before that, I just want to touch again on the idea of validity. So when we start talking about this chapter, we were talking about 2 different things. We were talking firstly about reliability. We were talking about 3 different concepts. So we talked about reliability, right? We talked about validity, and we talked about reflexivity, right? Now, the way that validity is normally understood when we talk about quantitative research methods is how you can replicate the research and get the same results again, right? For qualitative research, we're not so much concerned about reliability, because mostly what we're doing is we're trying to study occurrences that may not happen again. And because of this reason, reliability is something that we sort of do away with. So sometimes, for example, if you're doing, when we consider data collection procedures, if you're doing, for example, an ethnography, which is basically, the study of, let's say, a culture or a particular group of people. So you're studying something that's novel, that's different. And that is why you do not concern yourself so much with reliability. Or, for example, you might be interviewing people, right, who are caregivers of people with Alzheimer's, and basically you want to look at their particular experiences. And that is why it doesn't matter to you how reliable your research is, how well you will be able to replicate it given another group of people, right? So reliability in that way is not as concerning. But validity, and what exactly is validity? Validity is the idea that your research, it looks at what it claims to look at, right? So let's say if you're doing a research on, let's say, people's attitudes, let's say, or their feelings towards the Aurat March, for example, right? So you need to make sure that firstly your research questions, and that's why validity is not just, attached to one part of the research. It's not just attached to the conceptual framework. It's not just attached to the goals. It's not just attached to the research questions. It's a part of the whole framework. That is something that's very important to remember, that it's important to, keep concerns about validity at all the different steps, right? When you're conceptualizing the research, it's important. When you're, figuring out your goals, it's important. When you're constructing research questions, it's important, right? When you're looking at methods, when you're trying to analyze data, it's important to be looking at how valid the research is. We talked about how there might be different methods of going about this, right? So we talked about how one of them is something called participant validation, right? So what exactly is participant validation? Participant validation is when you ask participants to, go through the research and share with you what they sort of, feel about it, how valid they think your conclusions are. So that is one way in which you can have, some proof of the validity of your study. That's not always possible, obviously. So there are other methods, and one of them is that, you have to make sure, in order for your research to be valid, that all of this design that you have right here is coherent, that it makes sense, within itself. That is something that's extremely important, and that's very important to remember. that your research design overall needs to make sense. You need to have an explanation for, why you're choosing a particular research question, why you're, choosing to conceptualize your research a particular way, why you're, for example, choosing particular methods of data collection or of analysis, right? So all of these things are extremely important. Another thing that you'll find, with the research that we will now do, right, is another sort of concern, which is that, now, because everything has to be shifted online, your data collection procedures will need to change, right? Because you can no longer meet people in person. So because we had all of these different assignments that you need to start thinking about. So what we will do is that we will try to figure out ways of doing that research now, which are, which make use of the online resources that we have, right? Right, so here you have an image, right? When we consider qualitative research methods, right? So we had talked about one-on-one interviews, and we had talked about how usually, mostly actually, interviews which are done, in a qualitative research are semi-structured interviews, right? Because semi-structured interviews really make for a lot of detail. When you're talking about, interviewing, we've talked about how you do not have, basically, when we're considering semi-structured interviewing, all you have is an interview agenda. You do not follow, questions by, in the same pattern that you had written them, but rather you let the participant take the lead, right? Our concern right now is how we're going to do interviews in the current scenario, right? Now, we have different software for that. So for example, Zoom is one software that you could use. You could have something more informal. You could, use WhatsApp video calls perhaps. But then you need to think about the ethics attached to all of this, right? Because when you're recording someone, that will have ethical concerns, right? And then obviously when you're conducting interviews online, what is the dynamic of that? How comfortable is the person with that? All of these different factors you will have to think about, right? So yes, so when we're considering semi-structured interviewing, we look at interview agendas. We've talked about how there are different sorts of questions. There's structural questions, evaluative questions, contrast questions. I think we've gone over that. But now our basic concern is how are we going to do these interviews on the web, and what will be the ethical concerns that may arise from doing these interviews online, right? Then some of you, for your research topics, might need to do focus groups. What is a focus group? A focus group is basically that, you have a particular prompt, and then you're sitting with, let's say, a group of people. There might be 3 people, there might be 4 people, and you have them talk about, the prompt in some way, or you have them share an experience, and, they can comment on each other's experience. They can, build on it, and share their own experience as they go along, right? So focus groups is something that's also possible. Doing research online, I think we should look at it as another challenge, which will obviously come with its own, limitations, just like any research does. But at the same time, it's not that research is not possible. And even when we talk about qualitative research, it's not that it's not possible, just because we have to shift it online, right? Perhaps, this is an opportunity for us to get extremely creative with how we think about data collection procedures. Anyway, then you have ethnographic research. Now, that is something that becomes a little more difficult, because here you have something which is called participant observation, right? And participant observation may not be possible given the sort of circumstances. But again, that is something that we can, sort of think about, that how could we have participant observation, or how could we have a substitute for participant observation given the current circumstances. Then you have case study research, which is again, in-depth research involving a variety of research methods, data collection procedures, right? Then you have something that's called record keeping, right? Which involves participants to keep either diaries or journals in which they record their thoughts, their feelings. You might ask them to record their feelings about a particular phenomena, and that's how it goes. So this is, a method which might become extremely well suited to us given the current circumstances, right? Again, we have process of observation. We need to think about how we might need to sort of evaluate that, right? Or, sort of think about that. Right. Now, when we talk about reflexivity, because that's something we have sort of missed out. So reflexivity is basically the idea that, you as a research participant, so yes, let's say, you as not the research participant, sorry, but as the researcher, right? So you as the researcher have an influence on the process of the research, not just the outcome, right? But because, of who you are as a researcher and who you are as an individual, right? And when you are an individual, that obviously comes with sets of beliefs, that comes with, certain attitudes, that comes with certain preconceived ideas that you might have about the phenomena, certain expectations you might have, right? That comes with, your gender. If, for example, you're a male versus a female, how people respond to you, depending on what your research question is, might differ. What your age is, all of these different factors, right? They play into your, sort of who you are as an individual, and that has an influence on who you are as a researcher, right? And who you are as a researcher and as an individual, because these are really not different things, right? Can have can it actually not can have, but exerts a significant influence on not just the outcome of the research, right, but also on the sort of research questions that you devise, right, on also the sort of research methods that you're comfortable with, right? What sort of participants do you decide to work with? So all of these things, right, they are influenced by yourself, right? And reflexivity is basically becoming aware of all of these different influences, right? And thinking about it and reflecting on how you yourself as an individual and as a researcher have influenced all of these different areas of research in terms of what your analysis or what your method of analysis has been, right? What sort of interviews have you conducted? Have you done focus groups? Why have you been more comfortable doing one over the other? And for example, whatever method you choose, who do you decide to talk to? All of these different factors will obviously play a huge role in what you find through your research, and all of that is something that we call reflexivity, and it's an extremely important part of qualitative research. What we'll do is that we'll do an exercise on reflexivity. So I'll send out this sort of a memo, and I'll ask you to write something, and we can put that up on the discussion board. But basically, this was just closing off of chapter 3. We'll be starting chapter 4 now, which is the role of interpretation. So make sure that you read up on chapter 4 so that we can move forward. Thank you everyone for watching. I'll try to get better with my video content, but yes, so please bear with me till I do that. Thank you.